At 11:37 a.m. on October 26, 1944, Corporal Frank the Fix Kowalski was staring into the blinding muzzle flashes of a heavy German MG-42 machine gun nest. He was pinned 40 feet downhill from the main entrance of Objective Hydra, a reinforced, concrete bunker anchoring the final German defensive line near the small, rain-soaked village of Valmontone, Italy. The heavy 7.92 millimeters rounds were not just kicking up dirt. They were tearing apart the tree line where his squad, the remnants of the 3rd Platoon, 142nd Infantry Regiment, had taken cover. The stench of wet earth, cordite, and fear was thick in the cold autumn air. Kowalski wasn't a trained combat engineer or a standard rifleman. He was a grease monkey, a motor pool corporal assigned to temporary support detail, and he felt about as useful as a wrench in a firefight. Yet, here he was, staring at an impossible tactical problem. The bunker's position, carved into a reverse slope, was impervious to the artillery spotters who had been trying to zero in for the last hour. All conventional assault options, a frontal charge, flanking maneuvers, even high explosive satchel charges, had been rendered impossible or, worse, fatal. The entire morning assault had hinged on the rapid neutralization of Hydra. They needed fire. They needed overwhelming psychological heat to clear the embrasures and force the defenders into the open. The U.S. Army issued M2 flamethrowers were the designated tool for this job, capable of projecting burning napalm mix 50 yards. But the M2 team, led by Sergeant Riley, had been caught in a mortar barrage 20 minutes prior, 300 yards back. Their heavy equipment was useless scrap metal now, and Riley was gone. Kowalski was staring at the problem, but his mind wasn't focusing on cover or return fire. It was focusing on thermodynamics, pressure seals, and fuel composition. This unique form of technical desperation was exactly why Corporal Kowalski had been reassigned to the 103rd Provisional Maintenance Detachment, a unit officially listed for vehicle recovery and field repairs, but privately referred to by the Frontline G is as the Junkyard Dogs. The 103rd Provisional wasn't formed on standard procedure. It was formed out of necessity, fueled by official disdain, and built on genius improvisation. The unit consisted primarily of motor mechanics, disgruntled depot staff, and field engineers who had a history of requisitioning items through dubious means, or who had been cited multiple times for modifying standard Army equipment past regulations. Kowalski, for example, had nearly faced a court-martial in Sicily for grafting the cooling jacket of a captured German MG-34 onto an overheating Sherman tank turret, claiming it offered superior operational thermal management. The Army brass saw them as chaotic misfits indisciplined, perpetually greasy, and obsessed with hoarding spare parts. They were masters of using captured material, discarded fuel drums, busted generators, and anything not bolted down to keep the mechanized side of the war running. If a Jeep needed a carburetor and the quartermaster said, "Wait 6 weeks," the Junkyard Dogs had already built one from 3 broken radio components and a piece of scrap copper pipe scavenged from a local church. But their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Alistair Vance, a pragmatic officer who had seen his supply lines vanish during the brutal Anzio landings, saw them differently. Vance didn't see insubordination. He saw survival engineering. He actively shielded them from paperwork and regulation enforcement, allowing them to transform from official headaches into an indispensable tactical asset. The Army, Vance once told a visiting general, sees a junk pile. The 103rd sees potential energy, 10 pounds of pressure, and a solution that hasn't been invented yet. Their unofficial mandate was simple. If it's broken, fix it. If it doesn't exist, build it. Now, crouching in the Italian mud, with the screams of wounded men mixing with the incessant chatter of the MG-42, Kowalski knew their official task vehicle maintenance was irrelevant. The platoon was collapsing. They needed a flamethrower, and they needed it in the next 10 minutes before the German infantry inside Objective Hydra decided to counterattack. Kowalski's eyes scanned the immediate area. His M1 Garand lay uselessly next to him. A rifle could not breach concrete. He had two key items: a standard U.S. Army 5-gallon fuel can half full of high-octane gasoline, intended for a scout car that never arrived, and a wrecked M3 Stuart light tank 15 yards behind him, its engine compartment ripped open by a Panzerfaust hit an hour ago. Inside that tank wreckage were parts. Parts that weren't meant to be weapons. Parts that were engineered for mobility and power, not flame and terror. The pressure, the fuel source, the ignition Corporal Kowalski, the fix, had to calculate how to transform engine parts, spare gasoline, and sheer mechanical audacity into a weapon powerful enough to save 13 trapped men. The MG-42 spat a fresh stream of tracers, carrying chunks out of the logs stacked above Kowalski's head. He knew that the definition of a weapon was not its design, but its application. The dilemma was agonizingly clear. Risk blowing himself up attempting a truly insane technical improvisation, or watch the platoon be systematically executed by the bunker 40 feet away. He had decided it was time to start salvaging. The clock inside Kowalski's head was moving faster than the German rate of fire. It was 11:41 a.m. Sergeant Miller, the platoon's acting leader, risked raising his head slightly and was immediately rewarded with a splintered helmet brim. "Kowalski, you better have a miracle in your tool bag, or we're done here," Miller shouted over the din. Kowalski offered no reply. Miracles were unreliable. Engineering wasn't. He needed three things immediately: a container strong enough to hold pressurized fuel, a method for generating 150 to 200 psi of sustained force, and a robust, controllable nozzle system. All standard M3 Stuart components were built for ruggedness and high tolerance, which made them ideal for jury-rigging explosives or high-pressure systems. He belly-crawled, pushing his 5-gallon jerrycan ahead of him, toward the burned-out hulk of the Stuart, designated Patton's Pride. The wreck smelled strongly of diesel and scorched rubber, but the hit had concentrated mainly on the engine block, leaving the crew compartment relatively intact, though certainly not safe. The first critical component was the pressure source. Inside the M3 Stuart's belly, high up against the transmission housing, was the hydraulic accumulator for the turret stabilization and traverse system. This small, torpedo-shaped steel cylinder was designed to maintain constant, high hydraulic pressure. If emptied of hydraulic fluid, it could be repurposed to hold compressed air or, critically, highly pressurized gas from a separate source. It was reinforced steel, rated far higher than the jerrycan. It took 60 seconds of frantic, dangerous work, mostly leveraging a massive wrench he kept strapped to his pack, to disconnect the accumulator, roughly 14 inches long and 5 inches wide, from the scorched hydraulic manifold. Sparks flew as he wrestled the heavy cylinder free, the noise muffled slightly by the ambient gunfire, but still painfully loud in the quiet interior of the destroyed tank. At 11:43 a.m., he dragged the accumulator and the 5-gallon gas can back toward the relative safety of the tree line. Next, the plumbing. He needed a flexible conduit that wouldn't burst under pressure. He reached back into the Stuart's engine compartment, ignoring the searing heat still radiating from the twisted metal, and tore out a length of braided oil cooler line about 8 feet long, incredibly durable, and capable of handling intense thermal cycling. This would be the hose. Now came the true mechanical test, connecting the pieces and finding the propulsion. The gasoline in the jerrycan was too thin. It would disperse quickly and burn out before reaching 40 feet. Standard flamethrower fuel, napalm or thickened mixes provided necessary adhesion. Kowalski spotted a small overturned barrel nearby, used by the engineers earlier that morning. It contained a heavy-grade 90-weight gearbox oil, viscous, thick, and highly flammable. a perfect thickening agent. Working quickly, with his heart hammering against his ribs, he poured 3 gallons of gasoline into the accumulator tank, using a bent piece of aluminum flashing as a makeshift funnel, and mixed in approximately 1 quart of the heavy gearbox oil. The mixture sloshed, thick and deadly, inside the steel cylinder. This was the fuel and the vessel. The pressure remained the biggest challenge. He couldn't pressurize the accumulator directly. He needed an external impulse. He looked at the rear of the wrecked tank again and saw salvation: the CO2 fire suppression system. Every Stuart had a CO2 cylinder connected to nozzles aimed at the engine compartment, designed to flood the area in case of fire. The cylinder, about the size of a standard oxygen tank, contained non-flammable compressed CO2 at extremely high pressure, around 850 psi, far more than he needed. Kowalski leveraged his knowledge of field maintenance standards. The CO2 cylinder had a primary valve and a release manifold. He couldn't connect the entire massive cylinder to his fuel container. The pressure differential would instantly rupture the accumulator, turning the improvised flamethrower into a large, messy grenade. Instead, at 11:46 a.m., he worked with meticulous, nerve-wracking speed to detach the main feed line from the CO2 manifold. He then located the valve for the engine air starter system, a tiny, robust check valve designed to withstand high operational pressures. Using a small file and a pocket knife, he carefully began adapting the threads of the CO2 feeder line to the inlet port of the check valve. This check valve would serve as his pressure regulator and release mechanism, allowing him to tap the massive CO2 power in controlled bursts into the back of his fuel accumulator. He was building a bomb, essentially, and hoping the check valve would hold at the moment of truth. The men pinned down around him, watching the machine gun tracers rip overhead, saw only a mechanic frantically piecing together tubes and pipes. They didn't understand the complex physics and the suicidal risk involved. "Frank, what in God's name are you doing?" yelled Sergeant Miller, his voice raw with panic. Kowalski tightened the final fitting, securing the modified CO2 line connection to the accumulator inlet port. He looked up, his face covered in oil and grime. "Building a solution, Sergeant," Kowalski muttered. "But I still need a pilot light." He needed ignition, something that could provide a reliable, immediate spark at the end of the projection hose, 40 feet from the bunker, precisely when the fuel was released. The final component was missing, and time had nearly run out. It was 11:49 a. The Germans inside Objective Hydra were reloading. The German MG-42, affectionately nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw by the Allied troops for its terrifying 1,200 rounds per minute rate of fire, settled into a steady, methodical burst pattern. The sound alone was paralyzing. The platoon was demoralized and low on effective ammunition against the concrete structure. It was 11:50 a. M. Kowalski had the fuel, thickened gasoline in the accumulator, the pressure source, high-pressure CO2, and the delivery hose, braided oil line. He was missing the ignition mechanism, the pilot light, at the business end of his improvised flamethrower. A standard flamethrower used a small, continually burning propane cylinder and an elaborate ignition system near the nozzle. Kowalski had neither. He needed a reliable spark that could be generated instantly upon the release of the fuel mix. His eyes fell upon the few remaining weapons in the small trench they were occupying. Private Johnson had an M1911 pistol, standard sidearm. Kowalski remembered the principle of a flare pistol, controlled chemical ignition based on percussion. He needed a way to rig the equivalent of a continuous lighter at the nozzle. Kowalski asked Johnson for his pistol, but the man shook his head violently. "No way, Corporal. That's my last line." "I don't need the gun, Private," Kowalski snapped, his focus absolute. "I need the rounds." He convinced Johnson to hand over 4 standard 45 ACP rounds. The .45 caliber ammunition was designed for impact, but the primer, the small explosive charge in the base of the cartridge that ignites the main powder, was highly sensitive to focused friction or heat. Kowalski took the braided oil hose and secured a small piece of scavenged sheet metal, part of the Stuart's fender, to the end, forming a primitive downward curving nozzle. He then meticulously positioned 2 of the 45 rounds facing outwards, taped securely to the underside of the nozzle with heavy-duty engine tape found in his field repair kit. He then took the ignition lead from the Stuart's defunct spark plug system, a length of specialized insulated wire designed to carry high voltage, and wrapped the bare end around the primers of the 2 exposed 45 rounds. The other end of the wire he connected to the tank's partially functional battery terminal still housed within the Stuart's wreckage. The system was terrifyingly volatile. When the circuit was completed, by tapping the loose wire end against the terminal, the resulting surge of energy would cause the primers to flash, hopefully igniting the pressurized fuel immediately leaving the nozzle. It was 11:53 a.m. The entire monstrosity was heavy. The CO2 tank weighed about 20 pounds, the fuel accumulator 30 pounds, and the hose and trigger mechanism added another 10, 60 pounds of unstable, high-pressure, flammable equipment. He couldn't carry this unwieldy rig while charging 40 feet up a slippery slope. He needed cover, a distraction, and someone to operate the CO2 valve. Sergeant Miller, seeing the seriousness in Kowalski's eyes and the strange configuration of pipes, knew this was their last chance. "What's the play, Corporal?" "We need noise, Sergeant." "Maximum suppressing fire on the embrasures," Kowalski directed. "And I need someone strong to operate the pressure release. This is non-return valve, Sergeant. You open it, you get maybe 12 to 15 seconds of sustained fire before the CO2 runs out. It has to be timed exactly." He detailed the mechanism to Miller. The CO2 bottle valve must be opened after Kowalski was in position and after he gave the signal. A premature burst would either rupture the accumulator or waste the entire irreplaceable charge. Miller assigned Private Ramirez, a muscular rifleman who had been lying relatively protected behind a heavy log, to handle the CO2 valve and the large tank. At 11:55 a.m., Kowalski moved. He handed the nozzle assembly and the ignition wire, which he held clamped precariously between his thumb and index finger, to Ramirez. He then shouldered the heavy accumulator tank, gripping the crude, repurposed engine check valve trigger assembly. "Ramirez, when I shout fire, you open that CO2 valve fully. Do not hesitate. You have 3 seconds to get maximum pressure. Then you tap the ignition wire against the terminal. Understood?" Ramirez, face pale but resolute, nodded. "Understood, Corporal." Maximum pressure, then the spark. Kowalski moved out of the trench, low to the ground, relying on the suppressing fire of the 3 remaining riflemen, who immediately emptied their magazines toward the bunker slit. The metallic shrieks of the German MG-42 immediately focused on his movement. He started crawling up the muddy slope, dragging the 60 pounds of improvised weapon, every inch of movement a physical agony and a terrifying gamble. The enemy fire was so concentrated that the air around him felt hot. He was 25 feet from the bunker, then 20. The smell of his own scorched uniform, where a tracer had glanced off his shoulder strap, filled his nostrils. He reached a shallow depression, 15 feet from the main embrasure, dangerously close to the impact zone of the German riflemen positioned above the bunker entrance. He pressed himself flat, his homemade flamethrower ready. He could hear the distinct sound of the MG-42's belt being replaced, a 4-second window of silence. "Fire!" Kowalski roared into the sudden vacuum of sound, just as the German gunner seated himself back down. Behind him, Private Ramirez, his hands shaking, wrenched the main valve on the CO2 tank open. The roar of pressurized gas rushing into the accumulator was audible even over the returning rifle fire. The high-viscosity fuel mix was instantly pressurized to several hundred psi. Kowalski felt the sudden, violent surge of liquid rushing through the braided hose. He aimed the nozzle directly into the narrow, rectangular opening of the MG-42 embrasure. And then, with the pressure gauge screaming in his mind, he slammed the high-voltage ignition wire against the battery terminal. The detonation of the 2.45 CP primers was a sharp, localized crack that immediately ignited the highly pressurized, high-octane gear oil mixture being violently expelled from the nozzle. The result was not the finely controlled, steady stream of the standard M2 flamethrower. This was a chaotic, high-velocity jet of fire, a roaring column of thick, greasy flame that erupted from the nozzle at near supersonic speed. The pressure, unregulated and drawn directly from the immense force of the CO2 cylinder, was dangerously high, pushing the fire mix well over the anticipated 40 feet. At 11:56 a.m., the improvised fire column slammed into the concrete lip of the Objective Hydra embrasure. The heat was immediate and terrifying. The Germans had been expecting a lull, perhaps a change in American tactics, certainly not a roaring torrent of fire capable of turning the air into steam. The sticky, oil-thickened gasoline adhered instantly to the steel-reinforced concrete and, crucially, began pouring through the machine gun slit. The MG-42, which had been preparing to unleash its next belt, was silenced instantly. The gunner and the assistant gunner inside the tightly sealed bunker were immediately subjected to an inferno. Kowalski held the crude pressure trigger down. The fuel mix was burning at approximately 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, injecting itself 15 feet deep into the chamber. The accumulator was emptying rapidly. The CO2 pressure was dropping, but the effect was already secured. For 6 excruciating seconds, the flame roared. The intense, sustained heat began to superheat the steel MG-42 inside the bunker, turning it red hot, while the smoke and lack of oxygen created a psychological and physical breakdown for the garrison. Sergeant Miller and the riflemen watched, awestruck. The sheer violence of the improvised weapon was far greater than anything they had witnessed from standard-issue gear. It looked like a demonic exhaust port, spitting fire created from necessity and scrap. Kowalski released the trigger assembly. The CO2 had vented. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of burning oil, clinging to the concrete and the deep, muffled screams from inside the bunker. The mission had just crossed a tactical threshold. He knew the fire had cleared the embrasure, but the bunker was still occupied. He had used almost all his improvised fuel. The CO2 cylinder was spent. The weapon was a one-shot miracle. "Ramirez, get the satchel charges ready," Miller yelled, realizing this was their moment. The smoke and the immediate trauma would force the Germans out or render them ineffective. At 11:58 a.m., 2 disoriented German soldiers stumbled out of the small rear access door of Objective Hydra, their uniforms smoldering, their hands raised. The riflemen immediately took them prisoner, establishing that the main fighting force, the MG team, was incapacitated. The tactical dilemma shifted from reaching the bunker to securing it against a possible secondary defense line that might have been alerted by the firestorm. As Kowalski scrambled back down the slope, discarding the now useless steel tanks and hoses, Sergeant Miller clapped him hard on the shoulder. "You built that thing out of junk, Frank. You just saved the platoon." Kowalski, breathing heavily, checked his watch. The entire engagement, from the final charge to the German surrender, had taken just under 8 minutes. But the silence was deceptive. Objective Hydra was the anchor point. Directly 500 yards east, across a narrow, muddy defile, lay the next defensive strongpoint, Objective Hades. The success at Hydra meant they had opened a critical, time-sensitive gap in the German line. If they failed to exploit it now, the Germans would regroup and close the gap with deadly force. Miller received a faint radio signal from Battalion Command at 12:05 p.m. 142nd, exploit immediately. Proceed to Hades. Reinforcements ETA 90 minutes. You are the spearhead. 90 minutes. The platoon had 13 men, 4 prisoners, a single functioning bar, and 24 rifles. And now they had no more flamethrowers. The terrain leading to Hades was flat, open marshland, offering zero cover. They were entirely exposed, relying on speed and, crucially, another piece of unconventional engineering if they were to survive the crossing. Kowalski's job wasn't over. He was a mechanic who had just become the platoon's sole expert in highly volatile, customized weaponry, and they needed him to improvise something else, something for speed and concealment, immediately. Want to know if the junkyard dogs survived what came next, crossing 500 yards of open kill zone? Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover it. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories. Back to Kowalski and the 142nd. The clock read 12:08 p.m. The adrenaline that had fueled the assault on Hydra was rapidly dissipating, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and the stark realization of their peril. 13 men, exposed and deep within the enemy's forward defensive structure, facing a 500-yard sprint across the most dangerous terrain imaginable. Sergeant Miller pointed across the muddy, cratered field. Hades is right there. It's got a line of anti-tank ditches and at least 2 prepared firing positions. If we walk it, we're dead. If we wait, we lose the advantage. The field between Hydra and Hades was a logistical nightmare. A shallow wetland, heavily mined and zeroed in by enemy mortar and machine gun fire from the high ground beyond. Hades. Crossing it required speed and some form of protection from the inevitable suppressive fire. Kowalski was already analyzing the problem in terms of mass, momentum, and friction. They couldn't walk. They needed transport, and they needed armor. The 103rd Provisional Maintenance Detachment had always taught that improvisation was rooted in the immediate environment. Kowalski's eyes fixed on the detritus of the unsuccessful American push that morning. 2 destroyed jeeps, half a dozen heavy supply crates, and critically, 4 large, cylindrical fuel drums, 55-gallon steel drums, currently empty, discarded by the retreating engineers. Miller saw the fuel drums and frowned. We can't push those across the mud, Kowalski. They're too heavy, and they'll sink. They won't sink if they're riding on something, Sergeant, Kowalski countered, his mind already formulating the next engineering solution. He needed a low-profile, fast, and highly protected way to ferry men and ammunition across the kill zone. He turned his attention back to the wreckage of Patton's Pride, the M3 Stuart tank that had provided the heart for his flamethrower. While the engine and turret were wrecked, the chassis was still mostly intact, particularly the side skirts and running gear. At 12:15 p.m., Kowalski set the 3 remaining able-bodied men to work on the Stuart with the few pry bars and heavy wrenches they carried. The objective: strip the external steel side skirts and any removable sections of heavy steel plating from the tank's exterior. These plates were designed to protect the track mechanisms, meaning they were thick enough to withstand German 7.92 millimeters rounds, and perhaps even deflect heavier 20 millimeters cannon fire at range. The work was brutal, leveraging their combined weight to rip and pry the bolted steel sections loose. The sound was a loud metallic screech that was certain to draw enemy attention, but they had no time for stealth. The plan was emerging: create 3 small, highly mobile, armored sleds powered by the men themselves. Kowalski instructed the men to lay the flat, 55-gallon drums on their sides. These were not for fuel storage now, but structural components. The steel plating 3 sections, approximately 4 feet by 6 feet, each weighing over 150 pounds, was laid flat on top of the drums. The genius of the design lay in the utilization of the empty steel drums. The cylindrical shape, combined with the large surface area, would drastically reduce ground pressure, allowing the heavy sleds to float on the thick Italian mud and marshland, acting like massive steel rollers. But how to move them quickly? They needed motive force and directional stability. Kowalski scavenged the remaining section of the Stuart's drive shaft and 2 long pieces of thick piping from the exhaust system. These were lashed across the top of the steel plates, creating sturdy handles for 2 men to push from the rear. The creation of the Hydra Sleds, as they would later be called in unit histories, took 20 minutes of intense, desperate fabrication, fueled by the immediate threat of annihilation. By 12:35 p.m., they had 3 makeshift armored rolling shields. Each shield was about 18 inches high, large enough to conceal 2 crouching riflemen and their equipment. They were low to the ground, heavy enough to resist small arms fire, and mounted on rollers that could handle the mud. Sergeant Miller stared at the crude, but functionally brilliant creations. "They look like steel turtles, Kowalski. Will they hold up to a mortar round?" "No, Sergeant," Kowalski replied, checking the bindings on the push pipes, "but they will keep a man alive from a direct hit by a machine gun at 500 yards. And they're fast enough to cover 500 yards in under 3 minutes if we push hard." The plan was set. 3 shields, 6 pushers, 6 riders, including the wounded who could still fire, and a single objective: to cross the exposed killing field before the enemy could fully react and zero in their heavy weapons. Kowalski climbed onto the first sled, positioning himself prone behind the heavy steel plate. He loaded his garand. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was the point man, riding the momentum of his own improvised engineering. "Load up. We move on my count," Miller commanded. The men settled into position. The silence was unnerving. They knew that the moment they started moving, every German gunner within half a mile would be firing at the sound. They were about to launch themselves into a metal storm, protected only by discarded oil drums and the side skirts of a dead tank. The success of the second, even more desperate phase of the mission depended entirely on friction, momentum, and the hope that German aim would be slightly off. At precisely 12:37 p.m., Sergeant Miller gave the command, "Move." The 6 pushers heaved against the exhaust pipe handles. The 3 Hydra sleds, carrying the remaining strength of the 3rd platoon, lurched forward, the heavy steel drums rolling and sliding on the slick, muddy surface. The sound was a grinding, scraping metallic roar that announced their arrival to every German listening post across the defile. The pace was astonishingly fast. The rolling action of the empty drums, coupled with a unified push, allowed the men to achieve a speed of nearly 8 miles per hour faster than they could have run through the marsh with their full gear. For the first 100 yards, there was only the sound of their own effort and the churning mud. Kowalski, prone on the leading sled, counted the yards rapidly. He knew the Germans were zeroing in. Then the storm broke. From the wooded ridge above Objective Hades, the distinct, rhythmic thump-thump of German heavy mortar began. Simultaneously, 2 concentrated lines of machine gun fire, likely MG-34s, due to the lower rate of fire compared to the buzzsaw they had just destroyed, stitched across the open field. The steel side skirts immediately proved their worth. The 7.92 millimeters rounds hit the heavy plating with sharp clangs and sickening thwacks. The plates vibrated violently, sending shockwaves through the men lying prone behind them, but the rounds failed to penetrate. The improvised armor was working. The crucial design element was the low profile. The sleds were only 18 inches high, offering a difficult target, forcing the German gunners to aim for the small gap between the ground and the plating, or risk wasting ammunition over their heads. However, the speed also introduced a terrifying new risk. The field was littered with debris and hidden obstacles. At 12:38 p.m., the second sled, pushed by Ramirez and Private Jones, hit a hidden anti-tank wedge. The sled spun violently, tipping the occupants into the freezing, oily mud. Sergeant Miller screamed orders, coordinating the suppressing fire from the two functioning sleds while covering the vulnerable men. Kowalski watched in horror as Ramirez and Jones struggled to right the heavy armor plate and resume the push, narrowly avoiding a burst of tracers that carved a trench inches from Jones's head. Kowalski, driving the lead sled, realized they couldn't afford to stop or slow down. The Germans were adapting. The mortar fire began to walk toward the scraping sound of the steel drums. He focused on the engineering of survival. The sleds were heavy, designed for protection, but they were also a liability in the thick mud if they lost momentum. He knew they had to deviate from the straight path to avoid predictable targeting. Push left 20 degrees. Kowalski roared back to his pushers, Private Johnson and Private Davies. The lead sled veered off course, narrowly missing a fresh crater filled with brown water. The mortar rounds, now zeroing in on their previous trajectory, began exploding 50 yards behind them. They were 300 yards in, the mud sucking at their boots. The strain on the pushers was immense, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming from the exertion of shoving 600 pounds of steel and men through the marsh. At 12:40 p.m., they reached a line of submerged, decaying brush, offering a few feet of natural concealment, but also slowing their progress to a near halt. They had been under heavy fire for 3 minutes. 2 mortar rounds landed simultaneously near the third sled, forcing the pushers to drop the handles and seek cover. The sled, still upright, absorbed the shrapnel, saving the men inside, but the momentum was lost. The entire platoon was now halfway across the kill zone, fragmented into 3 isolated struggling groups, trapped between the relentless fire from Hades and the knowledge that the Germans at Hydra would soon be reinforced. Kowalski, realizing the entire mission was about to stall due to sheer physical exhaustion and the heavy terrain, made a split-second decision that countered all standard infantry tactics. Drop the weight. Ditch the ammo crates. We need speed. He yelled. His pushers immediately understood. They ripped the remaining heavy supply crates off the sled, leaving only their weapons and the wounded men. The lead sled, suddenly lighter by 150 pounds, surged forward. Kowalski, using the momentum, steered the sled directly toward the shallowest part of the marsh, where the mud was firmer. He had to draw fire, allowing the struggling third sled a moment to recover. He was committing to an exposed, high-risk run. He was now 150 yards from Objective Hades. He lifted his head just enough to spot the twin flashes of the main machine gun position anchoring Hades. It was a perfect field of fire, and they were rolling right into it. He had one last mechanical advantage left. His eyes scanned the ground ahead. They were approaching the edge of the anti-tank ditches deep, steep-sided channels designed to stop mechanized movement. The sleds could protect them, but they couldn't traverse the ditch. They had to stop, dismount, and engage. The challenge wasn't just crossing the field. It was surviving the critical transition from the rolling armor of the Hydra Sleds to the chaotic close-quarters fighting required to take Objective Hades. And that transition was about to happen under the most intense fire they had yet faced. It was 12:42 p.m. The lead Hydra sled, pushed by Kowalski, Johnson, and Davies, careened through the final 100 yards of marshland. The speed was desperate, propelled by sheer will and the need to escape the relentless adjusting mortar fire. The scraping sound of steel on earth was their death knell, but also their shield. They slid to a rough halt just 10 feet from the lip of the first anti-tank ditch, a dry, 8-foot-deep trench that marked the perimeter of Objective Hades. Kowalski dismounted instantly, dropping prone behind the steel plate. He counted the rounds hitting the armor. They were concentrated now, converging from multiple sources, indicating the enemy knew exactly where the American spearhead was located. Sergeant Miller, with the second sled, arrived 30 seconds later, breathing heavily, followed closely by the third sled, which had recovered its pushers. All 13 men were alive, but battered and exposed. The anti-tank ditch offered temporary cover, but it was also a killing ground. They were pinned at the edge, unable to engage the enemy effectively inside Hayes, which was situated 50 yards beyond the ditch line. The Germans had excellent visibility in the high ground. The primary defense of Hades was not the concrete structure itself, but the intertwined lines of fire established by two MG-34 nests positioned to cross-fire over the ditch, effectively making the breach impossible. Miller yelled over the sustained fire, "We can't cross the ditch. We'll be exposed the whole time." Kowalski was already assessing the engineering solution to breaching the trench. Standard procedure called for engineer assault teams with heavy bridging equipment or specialized explosives. They had neither. He needed a way to cover the 8-foot gap quickly and safely. Kowalski scanned the immediate vicinity, seeking any large, dense, discarded material. His gaze settled on the 3 emptied 55-gallon drums that had just served as their sled rollers. They were dented, but structurally intact. He quickly explained his plan to Miller. "The ditch is too wide for us to jump carrying our gear. We use the drums. We flatten the lips, roll the drums in, and use them as highly unstable floating pontoons. We use the steel sleds as ramps." The concept was reckless. The drums, once in the ditch, would be unstable, offering terrible footing, and they would be rolling targets. But it was the only way to get 4 men across in rapid succession to clear the firing positions. At 12:46 p.m., while the riflemen focused a desperate barrage of fire on the twin German machine gun flashes, Kowalski and Private Davies used their remaining pry bars to rapidly flatten the lip of the ditch, creating a crude path down the muddy slope. The first 55-gallon drum was pushed over the edge. It tumbled down the steep slope and landed in the bottom of the ditch, settling precariously. Kowalski took the leading Hydra sled, the 4-by-6-foot piece of tank armor, and dragged it to the ditch's edge. He propped it up, resting one end on the lip of the ditch and the other end resting partially on the cylindrical top of the submerged drum. It created a makeshift temporary ramp, approximately 10 feet long, angled steeply down and then up. Miller gave the command, "Ramirez, you and Kowalski. Go first. Clear those MGs." Kowalski gripped his M1 Garand, knowing his role as a mechanic was now entirely superseded by his role as an assault engineer. He didn't have the experience of a frontline infantryman, but he had the audacity of a man who understood pressure points and structural failure. At 12:49 p.m., under a hail of machine gun fire that chipped concrete dust off the ditch lip, Kowalski sprinted down the ramp and onto the rolling, unstable drum. It immediately spun sideways. He lost his footing, scrambling to keep upright, his weapon nearly slipping into the muddy water at the bottom. He reached the opposite bank of the ditch, scrambling up the wet earth, totally exposed for 3 crucial seconds. Ramirez followed 1.5 seconds later, providing covering fire as he exited the trench. They were now on the German side of the perimeter, 40 yards from the nearest MG-34 nest. Kowalski spotted the MG team clearly, 2 men, focused entirely on the breach site at the ditch. He raised his Garand and fired 4 quick rounds. The gunner of the first MG-34 slumped forward over his weapon. Ramirez immediately focused on the second nest, 30 yards to the east, unleashing a full magazine. With the immediate suppression of the crossfire, the remaining men of the 3rd Platoon launched themselves across the makeshift drum bridge, using the cover of the initial chaos. The entire squad was across the ditch within 45 seconds. They had breached the perimeter of Objective Hades, but the structure itself was not yet taken, and the Germans were already scrambling to deploy their reserves from inside the bunker. Kowalski and Ramirez pressed forward, sprinting toward the exposed flank of the main structure. They had solved the flamethrower problem and the crossing problem. Now they faced the ultimate challenge: clearing a reinforced concrete structure with nothing but rifles, 2 remaining satchel charges, and the ticking clock of 12:52 p.m. The assault on Objective Hades, launched at 12:52 p.m., was chaotic, brutal, and entirely unplanned. It relied purely on the momentum of the breach and the element of shock. Kowalski and Ramirez sprinted toward the main entrance of the Hades bunker, a heavy steel door set into the reinforced concrete face, 30 yards ahead. The German defenders, momentarily stunned by the sudden, low-profile infiltration across the anti-tank ditch, were recovering fast. Rifle fire began pouring out of a narrow observation slit near the door. Sergeant Miller, leading the main group, provided covering fire. "Get those charges on the door, Frank." The typical approach for this type of structure demanded a shaped charge or an explosive frame to blow the door outwards. The platoon's 2 remaining satchel charges were designed for lighter targets, carrying 12 pounds of TNT wrapped around detonating cord. Using them on the massive steel door was risky. The door might only be warped, creating a choke point instead of an opening. Kowalski, however, remembered the key lesson from the first bunker: use the structure's weaknesses against itself. He ran around the corner of the structure, seeking the inevitable weak point found in almost all axis field construction, the ventilation or exhaust ports. Every well-sealed bunker required forced air exchange, and those ports were almost never armored to the same degree as the firing slits. At 12:53 p.m., he found it, a heavy metal grill, about 10 inches by 10 inches, set low to the ground on the eastern flank, marked with a red warning symbol indicating the generator exhaust. It was protected by thick steel bars, designed to keep grenades out, but not explosives placed on it. Kowalski waved Ramirez over. "Forget the main door. We go through the engine room." He took one of the satchel charges. Instead of strapping it to the main door, he carefully placed the 12-pound charge directly against the heavy steel bars of the exhaust grill. The genius of the approach was twofold. 1. Structural leverage. The blast wave would be directed inward, focused by the confined space of the exhaust port. 2. Psychological warfare. The explosion inside the mechanical and electrical heart of the bunker would cause maximum disruption, smoke, and panic among the crew. He pulled the fuse igniter, setting the 7-second delay. Go, go, go! They sprinted back toward the main group, seeking cover just as the Germans realized what was happening and opened up with concentrated fire. The explosion at 12:54 p.m. was less dramatic than a frontal door breach, but infinitely more effective. Craw-boom! The charge detonated, shredding the exhaust grill and channeling a catastrophic blast wave directly into the poorly protected generator and air filtration room. Secondary explosions followed immediately as the generator fuel tank ruptured and electrical wiring short-circuited. Smoke, thick and acrid, began pouring out of the newly created hole and rapidly out of the observation slits. The firing from inside Hades stopped instantly, replaced by the sounds of muffled shouts and desperate coughing. Sergeant Miller recognized the decisive moment. "Second charge on the door. Kowalski opened the front door for us with that trick. Now we kick it in." While the Germans inside were choking on smoke and fighting localized fires, Miller placed the second satchel charge against the main entrance door. This time, the purpose wasn't breaching the structure, but simply opening the entry point to force engagement. 12:56 p.m. The second charge blew, ripping the main steel door violently off its hinges. The men of the 3rd Platoon stormed the entrance, led by Miller, firing their weapons into the smoke-filled, dark interior. The fight inside was swift and brutal. The German defenders, disoriented, choked, and dealing with fires in the engine room, offered only sporadic resistance. Within 90 seconds, the fighting was over. Objective Hades, the final anchor of the forward defensive line, was secured. At 12:58 p.m., Kowalski emerged from the bunker, his face smeared with soot, clutching a captured German MP-40 submachine gun that he had quickly commandeered. He looked back across the 500-yard kill zone, now eerily quiet. They had lost 2 men to the mortar fire during the crossing, but they had taken 2 key objectives and neutralized over 30 German soldiers, entirely unsupported. The reinforcements that promised 90 minutes were still far away. Kowalski knew the victory was temporary. The Germans would launch a ferocious counterattack to reclaim these critical positions. The 3rd platoon was now facing a new tactical requirement: how to hold the bunker complex with 11 exhausted men and limited ammunition against potentially hundreds of organized German troops. They needed to turn the conquered enemy defenses against the enemy itself. This wasn't a matter of combat now. It was a matter of logistics and engineering. They had to fortify. Kowalski had to become a demolition expert, an electrician, and a quartermaster, all at once. His eyes fell upon the captured MG-34s, now lying inert outside the trench line. They were heavier, more complex, but superior to the M1 Garand for sustained defensive fire. He knew exactly what he needed to do to survive the next 90 minutes. The clock had just struck 1 p.m. October 26, 1944. 11 surviving men, isolated inside Objective Hades, facing an almost certain counterattack. Sergeant Miller set the perimeter, assigning the best marksmen to the few remaining observation slits and the newly blasted entrance. "Frank, what do we have for heavy guns?" Kowalski was already inside the bunker, assessing the damage and the potential for defense. The generator room was smoking, but the structure was sound. Critically, the German defenders had left behind significant stockpiles of ammunition, including belts for the MG-34s and a crate of stick grenades, style hand grenade. The problem was the heavy German weapons. The captured MG-34s, lying inert in the mud 50 yards away, were vital, offering the high rate of fire needed to repel a massed infantry assault. But retrieving them under potential fire was suicide. Furthermore, the MG-34 required a specialized tripod mount for effective sustained defense, something they didn't have. Kowalski's solution was pure, improvised mechanical genius, leveraging the bunker's own geometry. At 1:05 p.m., he focused on the narrow firing slit that had been used by the German riflemen. It was too small to deploy the MG-34 effectively. The gun needed a wide arc of fire. He instructed 2 men to quickly strip a section of heavy, curved steel grating from the remains of the ventilation system, the same system he had just blown up. He then used his field shovel and a salvaged German entrenching tool to widen the interior of the firing slit, shaving off small chunks of concrete. The improvised MG-34 mount was built by welding, using the brief, frantic arcs of the now half-destroyed generator's short-circuiting battery terminals. Carefully controlled, the curved steel grating onto a heavy wooden beam found inside the bunker. This created a slightly curved, robust saddle. This saddle was then jammed tightly into the widened firing slit, positioned to hold the barrel and receiver of the MG-34 securely, without the need for a tripod. The curve of the steel grating provided enough friction to keep the gun stable during sustained fire, and the high-density wood absorbed the considerable recoil. At 1:15 p.m., after 5 minutes of desperate crawling under intermittent enemy probes, the men successfully retrieved both MG-34s and enough ammunition belts to fire for 15 minutes continuously. Kowalski mounted the first MG-34 into the improvised saddle. He checked the mechanism, loaded a belt, and fired a short, deliberate burst across the open field. The gun held steady. The arc of fire was maximized by the new mount. "That's 1 machine gun ready," Kowalski reported to Miller. "It's stable enough to be operated by a single rifleman." Next, he addressed the threat of close-quarters assault. The Germans would inevitably try to rush the entrance again, now that the door was gone. They needed an improvised anti-personnel minefield. Kowalski found a length of electrical wiring, heavy gauge, shielded, and several powerful dry cell batteries, also abandoned by the fleeing German crew. He took the captured German stick grenades, which featured a long wooden handle ideal for leverage. He carefully removed the porcelain ball from the handle cap of 8 grenades, exposing the pull cord for the friction igniter. He rigged a series of tripwires, using fine communications wire, scavenged from the destroyed radio room, running them across the primary approach path outside the entrance and along the walls of the anti-tank ditch. The tripwires were secured to the grenade pins, which in turn were connected to a central command post inside the bunker by the heavy electrical wire. Crucially, the system was not rigged for simple detonation. The system was rigged for electrical signal. Kowalski's design was far more complex than simple booby traps. He designed a command detonation field. When a German soldier hit the tripwire, the friction pin was yanked out, but the grenade was held in place by a heavy stone. The resulting electrical circuit completed a signal to a crude, salvaged light bulb inside the bunker, a visual indicator showing which wire had been tripped, but the grenade itself would not detonate for 5 seconds, the standard fuse delay. At 1:30 p.m., the perimeter was set. They had 2 German machine guns mounted and stable, a supply of enemy ammunition, and an electrically monitored anti-personnel field controlling the main approach. Kowalski was leaning against the cold concrete wall, his face utterly blank with exhaustion, when the distant rumble began. It was the sound of heavy engines, likely infantry assault guns and armored personnel carriers. The expected counterattack was coming, and it was going to be massive. The men glanced at the clock. 1:35 p.m. The American reinforcements were still likely 45 minutes away. Sergeant Miller, watching the tree line tremble, looked at Kowalski, the greasy corporal who had built a flamethrower from scrap and turned a destroyed tank into an armored chariot. "Frank," Miller said quietly, "if we hold this, you're not getting transferred back to the motor pool. You're too valuable." Kowalski didn't smile. He simply watched the small, salvaged indicator light bulb flicker slightly as the vibrations of the approaching armor reached the bunker. The survival engineer was about to put his defensive structure to the ultimate test. They had minutes before the first wave hit their newly fortified position. At 1:40 p.m., the counterattack began. It was led by 2 German half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadiers, supported by a wave of veteran infantry, hundreds of men determined to reclaim Objective Hades. The effectiveness of Corporal Kowalski's improvised defenses was immediate and devastating. The moment the first wave of German infantry reached the anti-tank ditch, the electrical indicators inside the bunker began to flash violently. The tripwires snagged boots and equipment, pulling the pins from the style handgren. The Germans, expecting standard pressure mines, rushed forward only to hear the hissing fuse of the stick grenades. The resulting scattered detonations forced the German infantry to break formation, clogging the breach path exactly as Kowalski had intended. This confusion allowed the 2 newly stabilized MG-34s, now operated by Private Johnson and Sergeant Miller, to pour down accurate, sustained fire. The increased stability offered by the makeshift saddle mounts allowed for controlled bursts that maximized casualty rates, something impossible with the standard erratic bipods. The 2 half-tracks, seeing the infantry stalled, attempted to bypass the ditch. The concentrated MG fire, directed precisely from the narrow armored slits, tore through the lightly armored vehicle's exposed personnel and tires, immobilizing them 200 yards from the perimeter. For 35 harrowing minutes, the 11 men held Objective Hades against overwhelming odds. The Germans threw everything they had, relying on sheer numbers and discipline, but they were defeated by engineering. Every time they tried to mass, Kowalski's fortifications forced them into deadly kill zones. The flamethrower had cleared Hydra, the sleds had crossed the gap, and now the improvised MG mounts and the grenade tripwires were holding the line at Hades. At 2:15 p.m., the sound of heavy American artillery, the promised reinforcements, finally began landing on the German rear echelons. Moments later, the first Sherman tanks of the 1st Armored Division arrived, rolling up to Objective Hades to find 11 exhausted, smoke-covered American soldiers standing amidst a field of German casualties. The final German assault broke, scattering into the woods. The 3rd Platoon had held the line. The breakthrough was secured, and the push into Valmontone was possible because of a mechanic named Frank Kowalski. Corporal Kowalski, who was cited for bravery and distinguished service, eventually returned to the 103rd Provisional Maintenance Detachment. He refused promotion, preferring the familiarity of the motor pool and the challenges of mechanical problem-solving over frontline command. He understood his true value, not in following the manual, but in rewriting it with spare parts and desperation. His improvised flamethrower, constructed from hydraulic accumulators and CO2 bottles, and his methodology for turning wrecked parts into tactical advantages, became legend within the Fifth Army, securing the reputation of the junkyard dogs as the ultimate survival engineers. Frank Kowalski survived the war and returned home to operate a successful garage in Cleveland, Ohio, where he continued to invent and improvise until his death in 1989. He never spoke much about the 8-minute window where he built a weapon of war out of oil and scrap, or the 35 minutes he spent defending a concrete tomb. But the men of the 3rd Platoon, 142nd Infantry, never forgot the corporal who engineered their survival. If this story moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you rewatching from and whether anyone in your family served in World War II. You are part of the reason these men aren't erased from history. Corporal Frank the Fix Kowalski and the 3rd Platoon paid the price so we could know freedom. All we're asked to do is remember. Never forget.